Queen Liliuokalani is one of my favorite persons in Hawaiian history. I've read about her many times over the years and have read her book, Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen. And when I was writing my book, The Volcano is Our Home, I had the opportunity to look at pretty much every chief and chiefess from before the days of Kamehameha all the way up until Queen Liliuokalani. She was a devout Christian, and she was also a person who happened to be the last ruling or reigning monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii. In 1893, when she was queen, a small group of American businessmen called upon the United States military to help them overthrow the kingdom. And that's exactly what happened. Queen Liliuokalani was arrested and imprisoned, and she wanted to do something about that, obviously. But she did not want her people to use violence in order to combat violence. In fact, she told her people, don't do anything violent here at all. Instead, she did many, many other things, like she wrote to President Benjamin Harrison. She also wrote to the president-elect, Grover Cleveland. She wrote to congressmen. She wrote books. She wrote songs. She wrote poetry. She actually went to Washington, D.C. herself on behalf of her people. And she spent a good part of the rest of her life doing something. Not everybody agrees, or at the time, not everybody agreed with Queen Liliuokalani's politics, but the Hawaiian people wanted her as their queen. She knew that over the last 60 years or so, the Hawaiian population was decimated. It was about 10% of what it was 60 years before her birth, actually. Most of the Hawaiian people had died by diseases that were brought from foreigners, but also from weapons that the Hawaiian people had never had before. And many of the foreign traders and governments and business people that came to these islands traded these advanced weapons for other things. And so the Hawaiian people, for the first time, had these weapons that could so quickly kill one another. Queen Liliuokalani knew about all of that, and she also knew that her people had access to many of these weapons. But she thought, and because of her thinking, she knew that it would be suicide for her people to use these weapons to try to fight the United States military. And so she said, don't use them. Let's do something, but let's do it very actively, but in a non-violent way. Well, I think we all know that Queen Liliuokalani never regained her throne or the Hawaiian kingdom, but she will always be the queen, our queen, in the hearts of the Hawaiian people. That's how Hawaiians think of Queen Liliuokalani. To me, she was one of those people that worked hard on behalf of justice. She also went to church regularly, and she prayed. She was the whole package. She had the thoughts and the prayers and the actions. She not only thought and prayed, but she did something significant as well. She didn't get the outcome she wanted, but she did win the hearts of the Hawaiian people, and she did put something inside all of us who are Hawaiian to know that we are a proud people, and a people who do not need to be ashamed of the color of our skin or our past culture, our dancing, our music, and our language. Queen Liliuokalani understood that thoughts and prayers don't take the place of action and commitment. Last Sunday, just a week ago, people in Dayton, Ohio gathered around to have a prayer vigil, a place for thoughts and prayers. But when the governor got to the microphone and began speaking, I think a lot of people had no idea he was going to be there or speak. All of a sudden, there was this lone voice that shouted out, "Do something." And pretty soon there was another saying those same two words, "Do something." And within seconds, it had caught on, and it seemed like, from watching the video and the news, that most of the people there were shouting those two words over and over and over and over. Do something. Do something. Do something. And I think he heard. And I think many other people who have not been listening also heard. And those two words have really caught on this past week, haven't they? Do something. Do something. Do something. I have been deeply troubled over the last couple of weeks hearing about the shooting in Gilroy, California, very close to where I grew up and used to play. El Paso, of course, Dayton. And as I did a little research this week, it occurred to me that this is just a small percentage of the mass shootings that have happened in our country this year. We get the news of the big ones when dozens of people die and are shot. But I was absolutely shocked as I went online this week to do some research to know that last year alone, there were 323 mass shootings in this country. And so far this year, a little past half the year, there's been 248. We are set to far surpass that horrible number from last year. I started to feel numb after a while as I was looking at statistics. For I realized that what I was looking at first were just the mass shootings where 4 or more people were shot at a single event or in a single incident. And there have been literally thousands of others who have been shot, whether it's suicide, one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three. It's mind-boggling, actually, to think about how many people who have been killed by guns this year alone. Wow. Then I looked at how many people have been shot, who have died, actually, by guns in the last 50 years. And the statistic I saw online at first, I didn't believe. I had to fact check it. Since 1968, and this was a statistic from, I think, 2 years ago, but since 1968, there have been more Americans killed by gunfire in the United States than all of the Americans who have ever been killed in any war in our country's history. Think about that for a moment and let that sink in. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and all the rest doesn't even come close to the number of people who have been shot by guns in this country. The people in Dayton, Ohio were tired of just thoughts and prayers. They're ready for some action, and frankly, so am I. I don't really care who is a Democrat or a Republican, a Christian or a Muslim. We need to do something. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. Now, I do want to say something about thoughts and prayers. They are so important. We need to be thinking about the families of the victims. We need to be thinking about the victims themselves. We need to think about what it's like to be a child who loses both parents in one of these mass shootings. We need to think about what it's like being a parent that loses a small child. We need to be thinking also about our politics and policies. We need to be thinking about the things that blind us and keep us from seeing clearly. Our privileges, our politics, sometimes our religion, our experiences. We need to be thinking about compassion and fairness and goodness and peace and hope. Prayers are also so very, very important. And the people who gathered together last week in Dayton didn't need to be told that. They were at a vigil. They were there to think and to pray. But it became so clear to them that thoughts and prayers are not enough. That's the message from today's Old Testament lesson from Isaiah chapter 1. I don't know if you caught that or not. Let's take a look at that passage real quickly here. I want to start out by saying that Isaiah addresses his prophecy to the leaders of Sodom and the people of Gomorrah. Now, I want to tell you that Sodom and Gomorrah have come up a couple times over the summer in our lectionary readings. I don't pick these readings. They're written out ahead of time. And every year, the church throughout the world tries to go through the entire Bible, actually in a 3-year period. We try to get most of it in. And I thought, that's interesting. Sodom and Gomorrah keep popping up. And it occurred to me as I was thinking about that there aren't too many other cities mentioned in the Bible that come up that often. There's Jerusalem, which of course comes up more than that. It's the capital city, the shining jewel. It's where the temple was. But I can't think of another city that comes up a lot more besides that than Sodom and Gomorrah, and especially Sodom. Even Bethlehem. I think Bethlehem is mentioned 50 times in the Old and New Testaments. Sodom is mentioned 47 times, almost as much as Bethlehem. That was kind of shocking to me. And so I started going back thinking about my messages over the summer when Sodom and Gomorrah came up, and it's really, really clear that the people of Sodom were judged harshly by God for their lack of hospitality for people who were different that showed up at their borders or at the city walls. Sodom was judged harshly by God for that and for its violent behavior towards those immigrants and refugees. And then I was reading some other things throughout the scriptures where Sodom and Gomorrah came up. And do you know that the prophet Ezekiel also said the problem with Sodom and Gomorrah were that the wealthy in that city were so wealthy and didn't share with the poor. The income gap just got so big, and the people on top had so much comfort and so much luxury and so much of everything, and the people at the bottom were starving. They were hungry. They did not have access to health care. They were dying. And Ezekiel judges Sodom for that. And I want to tell you that when Isaiah was written, every Jewish person knew the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. They all knew that Sodom and Gomorrah were judged for being inhospitable, for being violent, and for not taking care of the poor and the needy in their midst, and for allowing this income gap to get so big that people could actually live in luxury and not care at all about the widows and the orphans. Sodom and Gomorrah was known to every Jewish person at the time Isaiah was prophesying for that. And so Isaiah comes along and says, here's how God feels about all of you. And at the time, he was addressing the Jewish people who were acting just like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. They weren't welcoming the neighbor, the foreigners. They were being violent to people who were different, who had needs. They weren't taking care of the poor and the needy. And do you know what God said about them? Do you know, according to the words of Isaiah, how God felt about that? Well, Isaiah made it really clear in this morning's scripture lesson in our reading that Doug read for us just a few moments ago. God is sick of it. God considers it an abomination. God basically said, if you're just going to come with your thoughts and prayers and your offerings with those thoughts and prayers, I don't want to have anything to do with it or with you. I'm not going to even listen to your prayers. In other words, thoughts and actions, or thoughts and prayers without actions, God is not even going to pay attention. What a lesson for all of us. What a lesson for our country. As once again, we hear people saying, our thoughts and prayers are with the victims, without lifting a finger to make a difference, to do anything whatsoever. My hope is that this time it'll be different. But I think for myself that the church has a role in this. Those of us who believe in Isaiah and in Ezekiel and in Jesus ought to speak up on behalf of the people who are traveling from other places who are different that arrive in our country. We ought to speak up for people where there is violence aimed at them. We as a people need to speak up when the income gap is so big that there are people that are just struggling and suffering, and many, many of our leaders keep creating policies to make life more difficult for them and so much easier for people on the top. Now, you might want to say, what a flaming liberal. What a progressive. Folks, I'm just quoting scriptures. I'm just telling you what's in Isaiah and Ezekiel and Amos and the rest of the prophets and Jesus. It doesn't matter where you land politically in our country. If you want to follow Jesus, then you must care about the people who show up at our borders. You must care about people who are victims of violence. You must care about the poor and the needy. You must care, and you must do something. Well, I've been thinking a little bit this week about church history, as I often do. And it occurred to me that the institutional church, within a few hundred years after Jesus, began not being very hospitable to people who were different. Began actually being violent. And the institutional church actually supported wars against people who were different and actually participated in those wars. And the institutional church became extremely wealthy. And it seems like, maybe it's just me, but it seems like they kept trying to distract all of us from that and saying that Sodom and Gomorrah was about homosexuality, even though sexuality isn't mentioned once in the text. Such an amazing diversion and distraction, in my opinion, where all of a sudden, All that Isaiah said about Sodom and Gomorrah is ignored. All that Ezekiel said about Sodom and Gomorrah is ignored. All that is in the prophets and in the New Testament that they said about Sodom and Gomorrah is ignored. And the church went along with being wealthy, violent, and not being very kind to people who show up who are different. Sodom and Gomorrah were never about sexuality of any kind. But the church decided to divert everyone's attention away from what was really happening in the church that was just the opposite of what the prophets and what Jesus said the church ought to be about. So what is our role? My guess is that many of us feel that tension of wanting to do something, but not knowing what we can do. Perhaps some of us even feel hopeless, like nothing's worked before, we keep trying, nothing's happening in Washington, nothing's happening here, nothing's happening there. But part of speaking up is recognizing that as the church, we continue to think with reason and with compassion. We continue to pray for not only the people we love, but our enemies and the people who think very differently from us. But we also act. When I go back to thinking about Queen Liliuokalani, she did not get the outcome that she wanted. And for many Hawaiians, it broke our hearts. But she made a difference. Like I said, she's still queen in the hearts of the Hawaiian people. And I believe that every time that you think and pray and act, God honors that. And every time we demand that our leaders think and pray and act, God honors that as well. My hope and prayer for all of us is that we would hope and pray, think and pray, and act, and learn from our actions and from one another. What that means for you might be different from what it means for me, and what you might do might be very different from the person sitting next to you in church. But may we be committed to loving one another, even the people we disagree with, as we think and pray and act, as we do something. Amen.